meet and hear from a presenter who has not been here today. Her name is Janet Goleas, and she was recommended to me by a mutual friend, Helen Harrison. By the way, Helen Harrison will be here in a couple of weeks to talk about her book. Helen, as some of you know, is the longtime director of the Krasner House. She was a curator at the Parish Art Museum years ago when I worked there, and she wrote for the New York Times for many years, so she's a terrific person. I called Helen to see if she would talk about this book, which I had read a review of, which sounded interesting. She said, Janet is your person. So here we are. Janet said yes. We're happy about that. Janet is an artist, curator, writer, and arts advisor. As curator of the permanent collection at the Islip Museum from 2001 to 2012, she organized over 40 contemporary art exhibitions and expanded the base of the museum's fine art collection. Her art reviews, profiles, and essays have been published in digital and print newspapers and magazines. Her art blog, Blink, with 2 N's, now archived, was the first of its kind on Long Island's East End. And as an educator, Ms. Goleas has held teaching positions in New York, California, and in Nevada. As an independent curator, she has mounted exhibitions in public and private venues throughout the New York area. Her exhibit, titled The Moby Project, invited artists to create site-specific works related to narrative and psychological content of Herman Melville's Moby Dick, or The Whale, the cherished American novel. Installed across the historic Mulford Farm in East Hampton, the exhibition gained critical acclaim. Also known for her popular conversations in the arts, Ms. Goleas has interviewed some of the most significant artists, art historians, and curators of our time on location in galleries, arts organizations, and museums. She has a website, which is jmgprojects.com. We hope you'll visit it sometime. In the meantime, we're honored to have her here today. Please welcome Janet Goleas.
Thank you, Penny. I sound very important. So thanks, everyone, for coming. Tell me if you can hear me. When Penny asked me to come and talk about this book, I said, Penny, I didn't write the book. I met Mary Gabriel, but she's not a friend of mine. I didn't collaborate with her. I didn't work with her. I said, talk me into it. And she did. So I'm happy to be here. This was a massive undertaking for Miss Gabriel. It's an astonishingly detailed look at the development of the New York school between the years of 1929 and 1959. And some of the most interesting aspects of it were how artists survived during the Depression, the WPA, what the atmosphere of New York was like during World War II, and then after World War II, and why and how so many artists repaired to the east end of Long Island to escape New York City. And along the way, as Mary Gabriel tells this story, she also tells very salacious details about their indiscretions, their drinking, their over-the-top behavior in many cases, often at the Cedar Tavern, which I'm sure you've all heard of. And in that sense, the book is very intoxicating and a fun read, even though you may find yourself reeling from the amount of alcohol that was consumed in the 30s and 40s. In any case, I wanted to talk about what essentially is the birth, the ascent, and the eventual decline of abstract expressionism, which is a huge part of her book. And the book ends more or less when the idea of pop art starts its ascent and pushes the abstract expressionists to the corners. Excuse me. I'm not going to read my whole review. If you're interested, there are some copies. But I did want to read a couple of things about the book. Focused on America's cultural vanguard between the years 1929 to 1959, Gabriel tells the story of the rise of abstract expressionism as the U.S. climbed out of the Great Depression, only to be thrust into World War in 1941. Fleeing Hitler's atrocities, vast numbers of European artists and intellectuals sought safe harbor in New York City. The great exodus would dethrone Paris, making New York City the cultural epicenter of the Western world. And that's a major aspect of this important book, and one that you're probably familiar with. The 5 artists that Gabriel focuses on are Lee Krasner on the left, Elaine De Kooning, Joan Mitchell, who's on the left here, Helen Frankenthaler in the middle, and Grace Hartigan on the right. And this picture was taken at a solo show that Helen Frankenthaler had mounted. This is at the opening reception. So I'm going to begin with talking a little bit about each of the artists. The way I've organized the images is to look at their early work, and then toward the end of the images we'll look at how their work transformed over the decades, and in some cases in very surprising ways. So this is a self-portrait by Lee Krasner, who was obviously a very gifted artist before she ever went to art school. And she was the first artist in history to have a one-person show at the Museum of Modern Art. First woman. It was organized by Barbara Rose. The exhibit premiered in Houston, and Lee attended that exhibit, but she died 4 months before the show opened at the Museum of Modern Art. So that's a bit of a travesty. She came from a Jewish Orthodox family of immigrants and grew up in Brooklyn. When her sister died, her family expected her to marry her brother-in-law so she could take care of the children. It was assumed she would do that, and she said, "No, I'm not. I'm not doing that." And she left home and went to Cooper Union at 17. She studied at Cooper Union, and she also studied with Hans Hofmann, who had a private school. Hans Hofmann said of her paintings, "You would never know this was done by a woman," which was considered a big compliment back then. So one of the most fascinating things about this book for me was Lee Krasner is the oldest of these 5 women, and she was a young adult during the Depression and became involved with the WPA. And the fascinating thing, which I never had really heard put this way, is that it was the first, and you might say only time, there was gender parity in the workforce in the United States, because it was a massive program. As you see, there are 8.5 million employees, and they were all paid $23.86 a week. Male, female, didn't depend on their ranking. And Lee, because she was super smart and ambitious, rose in the ranks of the WPA, and the information on that time period in the United States is really fascinating. She was commissioned through the WPA to complete a mural that Elaine De Kooning had been commissioned to do. And he got fired because he wasn't born in the United States. So she was asked, among others, to complete the mural, which was never finished. But she created many, many small works that have been on view at Robert Miller and other galleries. Beautiful little gouaches in preparation for the mural. She met Jackson in 1938 she met him, and they became involved, and they married in 1945. And what else happened in 1945 was the hydrogen bomb, the end of World War II, and a number of other things that changed the world forever. You all know the story of Jackson Pollock. You'll find out much more about it in this book. And when I saw Mary Gabriel speak last year, some people in the audience objected to the fact that she wrote so much about the men that were big part of the abstract expressionist movement. And obviously you can't talk about this 30-year period without talking about the men. And one of the most astonishing things to me was that, with the exception of the Depression, it was very much expected that if a woman married or lived with a male artist, whether she was an artist or not, she was expected to support them. To work, to pay all the household bills, to put him first. And many of these women whose names we know lived that way. You know, this was before Simone de Beauvoir, it was before Betty Friedan, before the Kinsey Report. When Lee and Jackson married, he was very upset that she didn't want to have children, and anticipated that she would stay home and take care of him and raise their children. And instead, she embarked on quite an impressive painting career. Let me read this also from my review. During their first visit to the East End in 1945, Lee Krasner and Jackson Pollock vacationed with friends in a 2-room cottage on Louse Point at the far edge of Long Island. By the end of that summer, they were hooked. Springs offered not only the iridescent light that bounced off its shoreline, but it was a refuge from the post-war anxieties that gripped New York City. The couple found a 19th century farmhouse, and with the help of bohemian heiress and art collector Peggy Guggenheim, brokered a deal and moved in that fall. The house had no indoor plumbing, and on the rare occasion there was any money for coal, it was heated by just a single stove. Pollock and Krasner, both esteemed painters, would help usher in the abstract expressionist movement that transformed American art, culture, and intellectualism, and much of this important work was created on Springs Fireplace Road. Since then, New York artists had repaired to the South Fork to reboot from New York City. The Mary Gabriel's tales of the couple trying to turn this house into a home they'll take your breath away. They were so impoverished. At the time, East Hampton, or rather Springs, had one saloon and one general store. There were still hitching posts in East Hampton Village. I think there were movies on Friday and Saturday. Nobody had a car. Everybody rode bicycles. And there was a barn on the property. And Jackson turned it into his studio. Meanwhile, if you've ever visited the Pollock Krasner house, and if you go to the second floor, you can see the bedroom where Lee painted, which was the size of most of our closets. It maybe fit a twin bed and a bureau, period. But during the winter, when the house was cold, the upstairs was uninhabitable. So she moved into the living room, and under those circumstances, much like Jackson, instead of painting on the wall, she started to look down at her paintings and paint them from above, which sounds like a minor change in process, unless you're a painter. And a painter understands what a huge transition that is in your studio work. So she began creating works that were certainly devoid of any perspective or representation, and very beautiful works, including mosaics that she embarked on due to the fact that in frustration she started ripping up her drawings and gluing them back together, and that led to work in mosaics. So you all know this iconic image, and one of the things that Mary Gabriel paints so brilliantly is the incredible, earth-shattering power of Jackson Pollock's drip paintings. It was like an earthquake in the cultural field. And when Lee and Jackson met, he had been in psychotherapy and he was sober. She had never seen him as a raging alcoholic. And somewhere along the way, his psychiatrist was killed in a car accident, and he eventually descended into alcoholism of a type I hope none of us ever witness, because it was filled with rage and violence and self-destruction. So Lee Krasner became not only his artist wife manager, but his caretaker. And slowly her time in her studio became more and more suppressed. And this is one of it would be so heartbreaking if not for the fact that after his death, she went back to her studio and created some absolutely magnificent paintings. But she did, she was crushed by him in his lifetime. So imagine you're an artist and you're living with what the greatest critics in the United States and many in Europe are saying is the future of modern art. Your husband, the belligerent drunk, who is an immensely gifted artist, but had very poor, had no skills at living a life. please interrupt me if you have any comments.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Is there any like reported or documented like physical abuse that he inflicted upon Lee at that time, or is it more of like the mental and emotional abuse that someone deals with addiction?
I don't think he ever physically abused her. He did punch out Elaine De Kooning at a party once. He was just utterly out of control, and he, as you might be aware, was on the cover of Life magazine. He became instantly famous, not just in the art world, but across the globe. And he couldn't handle that. He didn't, Lee was thrilled because she believed in him and believed in his talent. But it was soul-crushing for him. And his drinking increased, and we all know the story of Jackson's decline, but you see here, this is 1956, and he looks not so good. So we'll go back to that in a second, but this is one of the paintings. This is now, I think, I can't read it, I think it's so this is 9 years after Jackson died. This is a massive painting. In any case, Jackson was, he had a lot of affairs. It was torment for Lee, but she loved him and stayed with him until he became so belligerent that she couldn't take it. She was too depressed, and she got on the Queen Elizabeth and went to Paris on July 12th, 1956. And on August 11th, 1956, Jackson Pollock was killed in a car accident, in a car that he was driving. People say she never got over the guilt of not being there, and I think that's so poignant because she probably felt if she didn't have her fingers on his shoulder, he would fly out of control. And what a burden, what an immense burden for anyone. On a lighter note, the depictions of major art critics and museum professionals and curators sitting at the kitchen table in that house on Springs Fireplace Road until dawn, talking about the power of abstract expressionism and the decline of the Paris school. It just gave me chills. The idea of Lee and a number of women, but of course a heavy emphasis on Clement Greenberg and Harold Rosenberg and Alfred Barr and other important figures. It's just beautiful to read about that time period. Elaine De Kooning was always referred to as this femme fatale. You see what a gorgeous young woman she was. She grew up in Flatbush, I believe, and I have to find my notes. But Elaine was not only a wonderful painter, but a writer, an art critic. She organized shows. She was a powerhouse among the art world, which was quite small back then, because she swayed dealers to exhibit work of the artists that she enjoyed and appreciated. And she got some flack for encouraging dealers to exhibit Willem's work. She was a wonderful painter, a little, if not a little distracted by her activism and her all the work that she was doing. And one of the things that surprised me was when Elaine De Kooning embarked on his woman's series, it wasn't very well received. It's not like the drip paintings, Pollock's drip paintings. People were frightened by the woman paintings. And Willem said that painting those works were so stressful for him that he thought he was having a heart attack. And his doctor suggested he take a little drink at night. And he was in his 40s. I think he was 41. He wasn't a drinker before then, and developed one of the most life-eclipsing problems with alcohol abuse of anyone in the art world. Elaine was also an alcoholic. It's hard to find someone in this book that didn't develop a debilitating dependency on alcohol. Elaine had in 2015 a retrospective in the National Portrait Gallery in Washington, but you'll see she didn't start out as a figurative, well, she did start out as a figurative artist, but she migrated to abstraction early on.
Excuse me, when did she live?
I'm sorry?
When did she live?
When did she live?
Yes, when was she born and when did she die?
I would have to go back to the beginning here because I don't have it memorized. 1918 to 1989.
Thank you.
Sorry, don't get dizzy. Anyway, any questions so far? Yeah.
Was she also a student of Hoffman, like Lee Krasner? Did they know each other at Hoffman School?
I don't believe so. I think everyone was a student of Hans Hofmann's in concept, and between Hoffman and Cooper Union, and other forces. It's such a fascinating book. I mean, you know the story of Hilaire Bay and the rise of abstract painting, and of course Alfred Barr was an important curator. And during World War II, he not only secretly escorted artists out of Europe, but he would take their paintings and roll them up in his sleeves to get them out of Europe and into the United States. And because of the surrealism in Europe, it was in large part Jackson Pollock who you could argue started out as a surrealist, that the transition between objective and non-objective painting started to take off. And Clement Greenberg, who was a brilliant, arrogant art critic, would argue that form equals content. In other words, he was a formalist. He believed that a painting that had any content other than line, color, shape, texture was old-fashioned, didn't belong in the annals of modern art. Anyway, I've kind of lost my train of thought. So this is some of the work that Elaine did at Black Mountain College. None of these artists spent some time at Black Mountain, but everybody went away in the summer. That back then, even when I first moved to New York, the art world just shut down in the summer. The galleries all closed. It was hot and people were poor. So why not be poor in some bucolic setting than in New York City? One of the things that happened after the Depression and the rise of World War II is that New York was empty. It was a ghost town compared to what it had been. On the other hand, during World War II and beforehand, this huge exodus of artists and intellectuals and scientists and teachers moved to New York City and Chicago and other urban areas in the United States. But after the hydrogen bomb and the end of World War II, there was such moral confusion. And I think it's one of the most interesting subjects in the history of modern art is how does a culture deal with the kind of horror of mass annihilation. And when you think about World War I and what happened in Paris after World War I and the rise of the Paris School, it was much the same in the United States. And then ultimately, not too long afterward, America became very prosperous. Lots of jobs. I think in 1951 the credit card was invented. There was a home for everybody, a job for everybody, except that the women who had taken over the workforce during World War II were completely dispossessed because when the men came back from war, they took all their jobs back. And these women that had been holding up the United States were suddenly thrust into this kind of puritanical America. And as you know, eventually the rise of McCarthyism. So this balance for women between power and lack of power, focus and lack of focus, maybe it's still going on, but it was definitely going on back then. So you see the difference. This is Elaine De Kooning, 1948, when she's really a struggling student. And like some of the others of these women, she struggled between abstraction and figuration. And this is a wonderful story about Elaine De Kooning leaving New York. I think in the late 1940s, early 50s, she went to Mexico. Eventually she got a teaching job in Albuquerque. And Connie Fox, who lives here, and a lot of us know her, was a student there, and they became great friends. And Elaine and Bill were separated, but they never got divorced. More about that later. But Connie insisted that Elaine and she go to the bullfights in Mexico, on the border of New Mexico and Mexico. And this completely transformed Elaine's work, and certainly provided the energy for an entire series called the Bullfight series. I think I'm talking too long. We have to speed up. Grace Hartigan grew up in Newark. She married at 17. She and her husband were going to move to Alaska, and that didn't work out. And Parents objected. She came back to Newark. They got divorced. And she had a child at a very young age with another husband. And one of the things that Mary Gabriel talks about at length is the fact that Grace abandoned her child and moved to New York to be an artist, and left him with her parents. And I think that was every bit as radical then as it would be now, and hard to imagine. Not that she didn't have any relationship with him, but the book points out, some problems that her son developed, which seems obvious. He felt abandoned, and it's hard to imagine that kind of ruthlessness. But of all of these painters, she sold the most. She was extremely successful. She was also an alcoholic. I say that because a lot of these people later on in life really suffered from their drinking, and I think she died of liver failure. Anyway, she was very successful. She sold Alfred Barr. I'll show you a picture of a painting that Alfred Barr bought when she was in her first exhibition. But she, of all these artists, completely fell off the map. Eventually, she left New York. She got a teaching job in Baltimore. After 3 marriages, she married a doctor and taught and lived in Baltimore for the rest of her life. And her work changed dramatically. But like Elaine, she bounced back and forth between the figure and abstraction. This is a gorgeous painting that she did in 1950, but you'll see as we move on that she more or less completely left abstraction as she developed. This is Joan Mitchell, who grew up in Chicago, went to the Chicago Art Institute. Joan was an heiress. Her family was very well known. They were socialites in Chicago. She was so mortified by this that she dressed like a boy when she moved to New York to try and downplay the fact that she was actually very wealthy. Her father wanted a boy, and this figures so heavily in the story of Joan Mitchell. Her father disdained her, was neglectful to her, but eventually she became, this is one of her early works, eventually she became a figure skater, and she was extremely successful, winning awards and touring in companies, and her father was thrilled that she was so successful, and they developed a bond based on that. But she had an accident and broke her knee, and that was the end of her ice skating career. Still, there is this kind of athleticism in her painting, and you can feel that energy of zooming across a field. And this is Joan many years later in her studio. She became a very successful painter, but also a complete expat. She divorced America and moved to France. And one of the fascinating things about Joan was that in Paris she hung out with Samuel Beckett and Giacometti and these incredibly famous often wealthy artists and writers. But according to her, there wasn't the kind of stigma attached to fame in Paris that there was in New York. And she felt a kind of freedom there. Eventually, she bought a compound about an hour north of Paris where she lived for the rest of her life. But this is a very famous painting, and if you look at the title and you know East Hampton, you know where Barnes Hole is. This is the story of her dog George, who you saw in that first image, jumping into Barnes Hole. Beautiful lyric abstraction. And yet the descriptions of her now, I know people that worked for Joan Mitchell, I know people that socialized with her, and no one agrees with the depiction in this book that she was an angry, belligerent drunk who was often physically violent, embarrassing in social gatherings, prone to serious depression and morbidity. And everyone I know that knew her, they was like, oh, she wasn't like that. So, and this is Helen Frankenthaler, the last of our five. And Helen grew up in New York City during World War II. So we're now looking at two different schools, the first generation abstract expressionists and the second generation abstract expressionists. And Helen her father was a New York State Supreme Court judge, obviously very prominent family in New York City. She went to private schools and then she went to Bennington. And when she came back to New York, she started dating Clement Greenberg, which was both good and bad for her career. But this painting, Mountains and Sea, was said to have overcome Jackson Pollock, like beat Jackson Pollock at his own game. Because the revolution of rolling out unstretched, raw canvas across her studio floor and throwing very fluid pigment on it, never using a brush, maybe using a broom or a mop or a stick, and creating something that hovered between abstraction and landscape, was extremely radical. And the accolades that she received very early in her career were phenomenal. So this is Helen on the left, Clem in the middle, and Harry Jackson on the right. And you can imagine how disdained she was for being a recent college graduate and dating the most powerful art critic in the world. So she got a lot of flack, and I knew some of the people that gave her flack, and they weren't at all sympathetic to Helen. This is her beautiful photograph of her on the cover of Life magazine, just really 6 or 7 years after she emerged onto the scene. All these people spent time, sometimes full-time, out here in the Hamptons, and as you can imagine and you've read about, in the summer it was just teeming with artists and poets, and the idea of artists escaping New York, as you know, it still happens today.
Janet, one question. Why did they start coming here? Why the Hamptons?
Well, I think the Hamptons had a bit of a history with, some of the early artists that came out here. It was cheap and it was by the ocean, but they also went to Provincetown and Black Mountain and, their Monhegan Island. The camps sort of split up, and Hans Hoffman, I think, was in Provincetown in the summer and had a school there, and a lot of people followed him there. But I think the proximity of the east end of Long Island to New York City couldn't be denied. That was probably one of the driving forces. So these two men were arguably the most important art critics of their generation. And on some level they were from two different camps, but they merged at many cross-sections. So, in my opinion, that photo of Clement Greenberg on the left is just exactly who he was. A sassy, cigarette-smoking, arrogant, brilliant critic. And as Jackson Pollock's career ascended, so did Clement Greenberg's. In some ways, he invented Jackson Pollock. Not that Jackson wasn't a brilliant and sort of earth-shattering artist, but without Clement Greenberg, who knows where his career would have been or how it might have ascended. So Clement was a formalist and believed in formalism. Harold Rosenberg invented the term action painting. So he believed that a canvas was the sum total of the action, the arm moving, the physical gestures, and mark making that was such a big part of abstract expressionism. And without being too impertinent, they all had sex with one another. There were so many affairs, and everybody was sleeping with so-and-so's girlfriend or wife or husband. It was just different than it is now. Not that different? Okay.
No. It's just not been chronicalized, I guess.
Well, maybe.
Wait 50 years.
Anyway, I love this photograph of Lee Krasner. Now we're going to look at some of the artist's later work. And every time I see this picture, after everything she went through with Jackson, and the guilt over his death, and the feeling of being eclipsed by him, and while at the same time exhilarated by his studio, what I always think of is dignity is the best revenge, because she just looks like a goddess. This incredible woman who ascended in so many ways after Jackson's death. Let me just read a couple more things. The title of Gabriel's book derives from a groundbreaking 1951 exhibit, The 9th Street Show, mounted by artists in an abandoned storefront in Lower Manhattan. Of the 61 participants, 10 were women, including each of the 5 here. Not unlike the 1884 Salon des Independence, forgive me, I don't speak French. In Paris, it was a call to arms, and the New York School was born. Yet the women who counted themselves among the avant-garde would continue through much of their lives for recognition. Gabrielle recounts the New York art world, which was punctuated as much by highbrow dogma as it was by heavy drinking and abject poverty. Debate, often contentious, fomented among artists and thinkers as they hashed out the polemics of a new world order in incubators like the Cedar Tavern. Gabrielle's account of this churning aesthetic revolution are breathtaking. And this is a great thing from her book. Imagine Pollock beseeching Krasner for an opinion on a new work, still wet, asking, is it a painting? Not, is it a good painting, but is it even a painting? That work, titled Lavender Mist, now hangs in the National Gallery of Art. That's pretty amazing. So as Lee got back to her studio, moved into Jackson's studio, and also took an apartment on the Upper East Side, her work, she resumed her studio practice. This is an image from a one-person show she had at Robert Miller Gallery, which I think was quite a bit after her retrospective at the Museum of Modern Art. But these muscular, brilliant, churning paintings they take your breath away. She was a really good painter. But on top of that, she made very smart decisions about the Pollock estate. And I think shortly before she transferred the estate to the foundation, it was valued at $20 million, probably quite a lot more than that now. And she started the Pollock Krasner Foundation to support artists in need. And it was she that quadrupled Jackson's prices after his death. So this was appalling to someone like Alfred Barr, who you can imagine everyone now chafing at the bit to get Jackson Pollocks because there won't be any more. But his $8,000 price tags were bumped up to $30,000 within months after his death. And it changed the marketplace in the art world. So you can blame Lee Krasner for that. But it was also a brilliant move that was inevitable. So, believe it or not, this is Elaine De Kooning, who abandoned abstraction and went directly into portraiture. And if you recall, I said in 2015 she had a retrospective at the National Portrait Gallery. She and Bill De Kooning never divorced. They separated, but even when Bill had his only daughter, Lisa De Kooning, with Joan Ward in 1956, Elaine remained married to him and eventually moved back to East Hampton. This is her with Harry S. Truman, who commissioned this portrait of JFK. Robert De Niro. You can see she's taken the energy of abstract expressionism and put it into portraiture, but she would never return to abstraction. Harold Rosenberg, our art critic. And this is Grace Hartigan, who, as I said before, just disappeared. Not that she stopped painting, but her paintings that were so successful and had garnered so many sales and so much support completely changed. She was very good friends with Larry Rivers, and together they would haunt the Metropolitan Museum to look at the incredible collection of Renaissance painting, which was unheard of in the modern era. And she embarked on this series of painting brides. Now, as I'm reading this, I'm thinking, really? Why does that make sense? But that would be the direction of her work. And it was also on the cusp of pop art. So Larry Rivers is often connected to the the earliest stages of pop art because he was one of the first artists to insert the figure into his painting. And he did that alongside Grace Hardigan. She always said her true love was Frank O'Hara. And what's not to love? He just looks so beautiful. Of course, he was gay, so their relationship remained platonic. But they were in love. They were a couple in many ways. And Frank O'Hara was a well-regarded poet who became very famous for his lunch poems. And he was also a curator and ended up at the Museum of Modern Art. But this is what Grace's work became later on. This Persian jacket, 1952, was purchased from a show by the Museum of Modern Art. And I think she never looked back. I don't think she ever painted another abstract painting. Helen Frankenthaler fell in love with Robert Motherwell, who was at least 20 years older than her and a very established intellectual and painter. And she continued on. Her career, you could say, very much waned. In my opinion, like Pollock, she had sort of painted herself into a corner and essentially didn't ascend from her studio works until sometime after her death. Now she's much ballyhooed. But it was said that her painting gave rise to color field painting. And Clement Greenberg, so devastated by their breakup that he was just as mean as a snake to her for the rest of his life, would praise color field painting, but he would never give Helen any credit for it. And this is Joan Mitchell in her studio in France. And she was dogged by these questions of lyrical abstraction and her affiliation with Monet. And she felt that she was completely independent and had no connection to Monet. But what she says there, can somebody read that?
French artists have a sense of beauty, a sense of color that isn't allowed in New York City to leave paintings French.
Now that's a great line. I don't think you could say that anymore. But she was married to Barney Rossett, who became one of the real avant-garde publishers in literature in the world, really, publishing Samuel Beckett and many important avant-garde writers. But they divorced eventually. She took up with a French painter, and she spent a lot of time in Paris, but eventually, as I said, she moved to France full-time. And she bought this, well, she inherited a huge amount of money, so she could do whatever she wanted to do. And she bought this sprawling compound outside of Paris. And ironically, one of the outbuildings on the property had been occupied by Claude Monet in the early 19th century. And I read a funny story in the New Yorker about a writer visiting Joan Mitchell. And here she is, this magnificent painter, just this treasure to all of us. And these tour buses come by, stop in front of her house. People get out, they look around, but they're looking for Monet's house. They're not interested in Joan Mitchell. Wonderful painter, just a deeply expressive, elegant painter. That's her on her property later in life. And that's a picture of her studio. And I know I've left out a million things I wanted to say, but I think I've talked long enough. Does anybody have any questions or comments?
I'm just curious, so only one of all of these women ever became a mother? Do you know if that's the case?
Well, Helen Frankenthaler married Bob Motherwell, who had 2 children of his own, but she never had any children. They say she adored those kids. But that's right, no babies, other than Grace Hardigan, who kind
Who
of,
abandoned their child?
exactly.
So, it raises the question, I mean, it raises the question, like how, and I wonder if it's true today as well for women who are in the arts, if that's something that they avoid. I mean, it also, I mean, it doesn't mean that they didn't take things into their own hands if they found out that they were pregnant and didn't want to be moms and, aborted the kids. But I just think the whole idea, this whole group of people that were, in such a similar place at the same time, none of them wanted to be moms, or none of them chose to be moms.
I
or
think
became
some of
moms.
them were filled with regret. But no, I mean,
There was not really a choice, I think, and if you
There
want to
wasn't
be
really a
serious
choice.
honest, you
Yeah.
could not be.
and I think, given the fact that most of them would have been single mothers, looking at their success in relationships, that's your studio right there, is that little baby. There's,
I get it.
yeah.
I mean, look at the next generation of women like Dorothea Rockram,
Right.
was also a single mom, and she talked about it recently, how hard it was. It's just, even if nobody said something out loud, it's just incredibly hard, and you had to provide for yourself and for the child, you had to provide for childcare and do the work, and be as tough as a man.
Yeah, it's fascinating, and I think women still make that choice, and often, get to be my age and regret that they didn't have a kid. And I don't know that will ever change unless we're all neutered and we have test tube babies in the next few generations. But the idea that Lee Krasner was the only person, and maybe among all of us, that ever experienced income equality through the WPA, that's astonishing when you think about it. And I had never thought about the WPA in that way, so that was really edifying for me.
Actually, that program would be really inspiring. All artists unite.
I know.
That's a
I
mass
know.
demonstration, and ask for programs like that. That would be really beneficial for society in general.
Yeah, yeah. Well, the idea of there not being any equivocation between the sexes and what their hourly rates were, let's introduce that to Facebook and
But
see.
I just want to put a little PS on this, because I find it interesting. So all of these women, were at a very low income level, for many years, and then now look at the value of these things.
I know.
I mean, the irony of it, and the decisions they made because of the financial level that they were living at, but now hundreds of millions of dollars that these estates have to be worth. It's quite interesting.
It's fascinating. I would say most of them lived long enough to be very comfortable financially. Some of them started out that way, but I think they all succeeded in that way. But it took 40 or 50 years to get there. And the art world completely changed. Of course, the abstract expressionists hated the pop artists and felt the lack of emotion and substance was appalling, and as the market rose, as you know, everything changed in the next 40 years. But here we are, still kicking. Yeah.
I love your presentation. I think it was so important, but I think the little tidbit, what these women said and what you noticed about them giving up being a mom and equality. What they did for us is that now it's the most important. Great art collectors are just looking for.
I know.
So they were our frontier.
Mhm.
They were the pioneers, and because of what they did, anyone who has any good money should and does.
Should, but they don't
No,
necessarily.
it's not true. The world's changed.
It's changing, but if you look at all the major collectors, they're very hesitant to still collect women as they do. But it's a question of money and what part of the game they're in. If you collect for purely money, you won't collect that much women.
I'm saying this because of the book. I did speak to an art collector, very, very posh, and he told me, read this book, and the people in Hollywood and the biggest collectors are. The pie is this big, and the pie is now for women and black women. So it is just happened, and that's right in your presentation.
Well, I agree that it's changing, but, you know, when these women, you know, most of the images that we looked at were from the late 40s and early to mid 50s. At that time, the only woman who sold work and was represented in museum shows was Georgia O'Keeffe. And that lasted for years.
Oh, the auction.
So anyway, thank you so much.